They called me unmarriageable, the way people name a weathered thing and set it aside to rot. 12 men found reasons in my body, in my father's pride, in the economy of respectability. They saw my chair before they saw my mind. They saw the tilt of my shoulder and measured futures they did not want. After the 12th man left the parlor with a curt bow and the sort of pity that is a blade, my father stood by the window and watched the tobacco fields fold and unfold like a slow, unending hand. He turned to me as if for the first time and said a thing that would be spoken of in whispers and in anger for years to come. I tell this as a woman who has learned the geometry of small mercies. I tell it because our family papers keep the dates and the names, because my own hand, greased from years of ledger ink and the soot at a forge, wrote the account of what followed. If you find anything extraordinary here, remember that extraordinary is sometimes the only refusal left to those who have been refused by the ordinary world. Before I fall into the story proper, a small request. If you stay with me through what follows, subscribe to hear the whole of it. Leave a like if something here finds you, and tell me in the comments what line cut you deepest. These tales are not mine alone. They are kept for those who would not let them be buried. The Whitmore place sat high on the Piedmont, as if to keep itself from the roost talk. A red brick house with white columns and a hall that remembered many guests. It belonged to my father, Colonel Richard Whitmore, whose name fit the county papers and the stretch of road. He taught me to read in a small, impatient way, not as a charity, but as a necessary instrument. Books came to our library in the parlor and in crates wrapped in oilcloth. I learned Latin enough to be exacting in grammar, and English enough to be dangerous with observation. I learned sums and accounts because the estate kept accounts in the ledger, and I, confined to my chair, kept watch over the figures like a sentry. My body had its own history and allowances. I was not broken. I was disabled in a way the world had not designed for anyone to respect. My chair, wooden, hand-carved by our own household smith, was polished until its spokes shone like small moons. I had an orthopedic brace later, crude and iron-bound, that sat under my skirts like a secret scaffold. These devices did not make me less clever. They did, quite often, make others clumsy with their assumptions. Suitors came and left because that was the custom, the liturgy of our species. What I mean by that is, men called, sat on our parlor chairs, measured my father's face and then mine, and pronounced verdicts that had nothing to do with my desires. I attended these audiences as one attends a sermon, with notes made in the margins of my mind. Each gentleman carried a reason like a lantern. Some reasons were nakedly practical. A Whitmore daughter must lift dowries, join households, bring land. Some reasons hid fear a scandal. How will neighbors whisper, Colonel? Others were thinly veiled cruelty, the sort that looks like concern. It would be kinder to her, sir, to spare her the burdens of a marriage she cannot perform. After the first 3 refusals, my father tried to laugh them off. By the 6th, he began taking note of the men's faces, the angle of their blame. By the 12th, his patience had narrowed to a point. He had listened to the county, to the minister at St. Luke's, to the cousins who worried about the family line. He had watched me in my study, my hands inked, my cheeks flushed from the stove's heat as I practiced accounts and practiced letters. He loved me by the measure of a man who only knew how to measure things: land, yield, reputation. He loved me and feared for what the world would do to me if he did nothing. So he did something that shocked the household. The announcement came one night after the candles had guttered low and the servants had folded themselves into the clear, obedient silence of the manor. My father called me to the library and closed the door. He kept his voice small and exact. "Elena," he said, 12 men have refused to make you into a Whitmore wife.
Perhaps the world cannot hold you as such without making you less than you are. So I will do what is legal and what I can do in the way of security. You are my daughter. I will not and cannot consign you to the town's pity." He spoke of options as if laying them out like coins. There were offers to send me to a relative's northern town, to place me as an heiress under the care of an aunt. He dismissed those as exile. He spoke, too, of respectable convents and houses where ladies with certain needs could be tended. Another exile in a different language. Then, in a tone that cut like an oar, he said, "There is Josiah." I had known Josiah. Who had not? He was the household blacksmith, an enormous man with hands like the outside of a plow, a man who breathed heat into iron and turned it into things that held. He walked with the careful steps of someone who had been measured by ropes and chains and who now learned to map the ground with his feet. I had watched him work for years, his sleeves rolled, the spark of the hammer bright as a small conviction. He was owned, as the papers say, and yet every time he made a shoe or a hinge, he put into it an artistry that suggested freedom.
When my father said his name, I felt the room tilt. I saw in a flash the faces of those 12 men, tight, quick to leave, and their calculations. I thought to speak a word of protest. Instead, I sat very still and listened to the way my father proposed his plan. "I will give you to Josiah," he said. It was not the blunt barb of ownership, but an arrangement. I will offer the household to bind what nature has withheld. I will make Josiah free. If you will consent, I will see to it that he is no longer owned. He will take your name if you desire, and he will be of my house by right, not by bargain. My first response was sharp and private. I imagined myself made into an experiment, a solution. I thought of Josiah as a man and not as a remedy. I considered the wound I might further inflict upon him by being used as a kind of reparative policy for my father's conscience. I had, in my life, learned to count risks as carefully as sums. This choice was a ledger with 2 columns. But my father surprised me then. He had watched the same county. He had noted over the years that men who thought themselves bold by virtue of name were not so bold in private. He had seen the way I read, the way I had kept ledgers, the nights I sat by the parlor lamp translating lines from a battered folio of Shakespeare. He had watched me run fingers over the ironwork Josiah had made for the stair rail and feel in the metal a kinship. What he offered was not charity, but a radical rewriting of a contract. "Do you understand what I would ask?" he said. "Do you consent to this on your terms?" This was his attempt at asking the only question that ought to have mattered. Consent, in the way he offered it, was an odd coin, in a country where consent can be masked by customs. He promised, with the stubbornness that had made him a colonel, to free Josiah by whatever means could be found, letters, purchasers, or the help of friends in Philadelphia, and to set up a marriage that would be recognized in a place that would allow such a union. He said he feared no scandal as much as he feared that I, his daughter, be left to the mercy of pity. I cannot pretend I fell in love that evening. I can say, with more honesty, that I felt interest, an interest that carried with it the hope for mutual recognition. That hope is not the same as romance at first glance. It is a sober, slow fire kindled by intelligence and respect. I had never wanted a man who pitied me. I wanted someone who would read me as I read a page, who would see what I could wield with my hands and my mind, and who could bear me as I would bear him. Josiah and I met properly in the forge the next morning. He arrived with soot under his fingernails and a wary smile that belonged to a man who has learned to measure trust by degrees. The forge smelled of coal, hot iron, and the faint oil of leather. The bellows breathed like some great sleeping animal. The hammer fell and rang like a judged bell. "You're the colonel's daughter," he said, with that economy of speech that belongs to men who have little reason to waste words. He had read me by my hands, ink,
small calluses, the careful tremor when I turned a page. "And you are Josiah," I answered. "I have seen your work." He blinked as if hearing a compliment was a sort of hazard. Then he set aside the piece he was working and came nearer, not in a show but in a practicality. He asked if I wished to look at the hinge he had been shaping, and explained with surprising facility how the metal had to be run hot, then cooled in the right oil. He spoke with a patience I would later come to know as his steadiness. When he admitted, softly, that he had been taught to read by a woman who worked in the kitchen, Missy Mary, she liked to teach when she had herself a pot to watch, I felt the first small bloom of kinship between us. He had read in secret when he could. He had taught himself to hunt words in the same stubborn way he hunted the temper of iron. Our conversations began with plain things, the angle of a hinge, the margin of a ledger, the cadence of a line from The Tempest that I quoted and he recognized with a nod. We shared passages, not whole plays, snatches that fit our moods. He favored lines that spoke of belonging and of chains. I favored phrases about the sea, because neither of us had seen much of it. There were practicalities to the plan. My father set to work the way a man unaccustomed to changing his mind acts when he decides to be earnest. He wrote letters that were folded and sent to a friend in Philadelphia, a man named Elias, who kept accounts, and who answered with cautious warmth. My father insisted on keeping much of the arrangement in the family papers. There are pages in our chest where the dates are penciled in my father's hand, where the name Josiah is written and then crossed out and then written again with a small note, "To be freed, methods herein." He called in favors, paid sums, negotiated the laws as best he could without inviting the county's censure. But no amount of legality made the first public act any less a scandal. The household murmured, and the neighbors raised eyebrows that could climb like a swarm of stinging insects into the courthouse square. My cousins wrote that it would ruin the Whitmore reputation. The minister said the arrangement was a test of God's will and that he would pray for illumination. These were the background noises that form the shape of any radical thing, the chorus of the comfortable. Josiah and I did not marry in a great church in the town square. There was no celebrated proclamation. What we had, on the first night after the colonel told the household his plan, was a small understanding and the quiet hilarity of those who survive by making their own laws. He brought to my room a small wooden stool he had made himself so that his knees would not strike my wheelchair spokes when we read together. He held the stool near my lamp as we sat with a battered folio between us. The flame bent against the glass and made little halos on the page. "Will you read to me?" I asked him. He hesitated, as if the offer were a fragile thing. Then he opened the book and read aloud, in a voice that got steadier with every line. He mispronounced a word now and then, in the sort of charming way that betrays a mind impatient with formality. When he came upon a line that spoke of servitude as a weight of the world, he paused and looked up at me, the way one looks up at a map and sees their place on it. "You ever wish," he said then, "to be more than what anyone says you are?" It was not exactly a romantic whisper. It was a question that reached into the quality of our lives. I answered plainly, "I wish for that every day." We worked then, not as lovers overcome, but as conspirators in the project of a common life. He taught me how to strike, and how to feather the bellows. I taught him ledgers and letters, the ribbons of numbers that could be made to make sense. There is a pleasure in mutual instruction that is not sentimental. It is the pleasure of two minds building a table together, and discovering, with each join, the sturdiness of the thing. He learned the columns of a ledger, and I learned the patience required to wait for fire to cool. Word moved through the servants quicker than it did the gentry. The cook, who had taught Josiah to read, kept a wary smile and brought us bread and a jar of cider when we worked late. The housemaids swapped small, sacred confidences. "Elalina likes him," they would say, meaning to pass along sympathy or gossip, depending on their mood. In the quarters, men who had measured a life by the progress of their hands watched a different sort of miracle, a plan for freedom being sketched, not in the language of law, but in the language of stubborn work. My father, to his credit or to his remorse, call it what you will, was not content with sentiment. He wanted proof. He wanted to know that Josiah was a man who would not be cowed by the county or by the cruelties that stalked our roads. So he set before him a test that was as old as honor itself. "Take the forge and make me a hinge that will not break under 70 pounds, he told Josiah one morning in front of the men. He set down a weight and looked at Josiah with the sort of look that had managed regiments and led to harvests. I watched him from the doorway as if I could absorb a verdict by sight. Josiah bent to the iron as if it were a sermon. He measured, heated, struck, cooled. The metal sang like something being coaxed into being. When he fitted the hinge to the heavy pantry door and lifted the weight, 70 pounds, then 80, no metal failed. The men who watched muttered, but with something like respect. After that, the talk in the county shifted. It was a small thing to some, a hinge, but in a world of reputations, a hinge that holds is worth a small household's esteem. My father began, slowly, to show the marks of a man who had done a courageous thing, and then wondered how he would bear the consequences. He brought the necessary papers, family notes, letters to allies, sums parceled out to secure Josiah's legal freedom in another town. He insisted on a ceremony not in the white columns of our home, but in a little church across the river where the minister was less inclined to listen to the county's judges. The marriage was recorded. The paper that bound us was later kept in a chest labeled "Family Papers," preserved. The scandal did not die. It simmered like a pot left too long on the stove. Some neighbors would no longer meet my father's eye. My cousins cut their visits short. The minister, who had given us the plank of a quiet benediction, later offered prayers for the restoration of things he had not imagined restoring. But the household settled into a new rhythm, the kind that follows real work. Caring for the children of the estate, managing accounts, making the forge produce enough to pay for what the county would not. There were moments of tenderness that changed the shape of me. Josiah read to our son Thomas the first time he held the child on his knee, and the child fell asleep to the sound of the hammer's memory echoing in his father's voice. I watched Josiah cradle our daughter Margaret as if she were a small hinge he had made to hold a future, and he hummed low little maps of words as he did so. There was a day when I mended a broken chain with my own hands, and found in it, absurdly, a kind of triumph. That my body, so often a ledger of lacks, could fix metal and mend things again. Yet always the world waited like a tide. We lived in borrowed time, not because we expected violence daily, but because every choice had to be measured against the law and men's appetite for propriety. We traveled north on a carriage that smelled of wet leather and brought with us the necessary papers and a chest of belongings. Philadelphia welcomed us with the narrow kindness of a city that had room for many ways of living but was not without its own judgments. There we set the smithy up afresh. Josiah worked as if his hands had been given a second vocabulary. The forge became a place where freed men and women learned trades, where children learned the names of tools, where a woman in a chair taught bookkeeping to young apprentices who had never known the grammar of sums. Letters came to us over the years, some from those who could not forgive my father, some from neighbors who had been softened or made quiet by time. Family papers accumulated. A marriage certificate, petitions for freedom, a name change that set Josiah as Josiah Freeman in the records we kept, a name he accepted as though he were choosing a place on a map rather than taking something new. We kept those documents pressed between pages, as one presses flowers, a way to preserve a story from the dampness of common talk. I will not lie and say everything was easy. There were nights when I heard the county bells toll far off, and my heart became a small animal. There were men who followed our cart with horses' hooves beating like warning drums. Once a stranger in a tavern looked at my hand on Josiah's and spat. "You would trade a Whitmore for a blacksmith?" But then there were mornings when a child's laugh would stitch the world together again, and the feel of cold iron under our palms would be a hymn. There is a particular day I keep with me because it was the day I knew the marriage would endure whatever the county had to offer. We were in the yard by the forge. Josiah had the apprentice boy balancing a thin rod over the coals, and our eldest son, Thomas, was learning to mark nails with the count of 1, 2, 3. A man came down the lane, tall, linen sharp, a traveler by the look of his boots. He stopped in front of us and studied the firm that held our hands together. He was the sort of man who knew law and maps of property, yet he looked at my wheelchair and then at Josiah's face, and his expression went soft, like an old poem he had almost remembered. "You must be the Whitmores I've heard of," he said. "I trade in ledgers." My father, who had come north with us and who aged in ways I could never have expected, met the man's eye. "We are," he said simply. "We have a forge and have kept our accounts clean." "It is a rare thing," the man said, "to see
A Whitmore temper and a smith's hand beside her. You upheld what you set out to do." My father looked at me then and laughed, a thin, incredulous sound. "You should have seen the county," he said. "They said they would never hold to what we did. They thought I had lost reason. Yet here we are, keeping our accounts and feeding the children. That, I take, is the measure of reason." Josiah's hand tightened in mine. We were not, perhaps, as celebrated as some romances might demand. We did not have the world's approval. But I had, by then, apprenticed my life to a kind of steady labor. I had a man beside me who loved me for my steady labor, too. The forge had become a symbol of our making. The ledger had become proof of our keeping. Even now, decades later, there are those who will say my father gave me away. It is a convenient story for those who need to believe in neat explanations. But papers in the chest, the family papers we preserved, tell a more careful history. They show, in my own hand and in Josiah's, signatures that were not forced but chosen. They show a man who was once owned and who became a partner. They show children born into a household of mutual tending. We were, in a way, a small revolution held together by nails and numbers. We lived in a borrowed time until December 15th, until the day a rumor reached our town and the thing we had built was at risk of being pried apart. The rumor was small as a stone tossed into a pond, but its ripples reached the county seat and found ears eager for scandal. I remember the day the gossip arrived because of the way Josiah's hand shook when it closed over mine. It was the only time I ever saw him lose balance. We did not yet know what that day would demand of us. We had learned to make hinges that held. We had learned the art of stacking papers that could be read by men who never thought us other than they had been taught. But the world beyond the forge is larger than any of these private proofs. There are judges, and there are men with ledgers thicker than compassion, and there are customs that have the force of law. When the rumor traveled in from the county, we felt it as a cold wind that might blow our house apart. What happened after the rumor, how my father chose to stand on a moral edge, and what that choice cost him and saved us, needs the telling of a steady hand. It is in those days that the truth of what it means to be free and to be married, to be respected and to be feared, came to the fore. I will tell it, and I will tell you how Josiah and I learned to hold one another when it mattered most.
But that telling requires the patience of the forge, the settling of metal, the striking of hinges, and the slow cooling that makes a piece endure. For that reason, and because the story is long and full of small proofs, I will continue. The summons arrived on a morning that smelled of frost and coal. A rider from the county seat had paused at the lane and handed my father a folded sheet. He broke the seal with fingers that still trembled from age and from the heat of the forge in his veins, and then he read without a sound. We gathered around him as if to shelter him from what the paper held. The children pressed close. Even the apprentice boy stopped striking metal and watched. It was not a long letter. It named the complainant, an official of the county whose boots were shined and whose ledger was thicker than mercy. It said there had been a petition questioning the legality of our union, and that my family's holdings, what little land and what the forge had accrued, were held in consequence until the truth could be established. The language was clinical, the threat plain. Come to the county on the date set. Bring your papers. Josiah's hand tightened around mine as my father folded the sheet and tucked it into his coat. For a moment he stood like the anvil itself, immovable. Then his shoulders made a sound that was not unlike surrender and not unlike resolve. "We will go," he said. He did not ask whether I wanted him to go. His face made no such question necessary. There are small violences that rumor performs. It is not only the accusation. It is the way suspicion tilts neighbors' faces into other shapes. The week between the summons and the day we were to appear at the county seat was a study in those transformations. Courting women crossed the street to avoid meeting my eyes. A man who had traded iron for grain for 20 years found reasons to say he had forgotten the exact weight of a bolt. The children, most cruel truth of all, heard the whispering and repeated it in the schoolyard in ways that disguised cruelty as curiosity. At home, we worked as if to stitch the world back together. I kept at my bench beside the forge, my hands finding the rhythm that steadied my heart. The ledger that lay on the shelf was a small miracle. Neat entries, our signatures in the margins, receipts, the stubby marks where a child's thumb had once smeared ink. Each line was a defense by other means. Each nail counted was an argument for our right to continue. But paper that holds proof can also be set aside by men whose interest lies in power rather than in truth. My father did not propose secrecy. He did not suggest that we bribe or bargain. He set the ledger and the chest of family papers on the table
and looked at us in a way that made the room very small and very bright. "If they will ask for truth," he said, "then we shall not hide it. If they would take from us because they find a story they prefer, then let them know the cost of that taking." For some men, courage is a posture. For my father, it was a calculation of principle. He could have sent a lawyer. He could have paid handsomely for counsel that wore polite words and smoothed over inconvenient details. Instead, he took the papers and said he would go himself. He took the oldest records, the receipts for the purchase of a manumission, the affidavits of those who had witnessed it, the marriage contract that bore our names, and put them all into a satchel that had once been mine when I was a child learning to carry coal to the hearth. The county seat was a town of low roofs and high faces. Men sat on the courthouse steps and watched us arrive as if we had been a show, as if scandal were a form of entertainment. The courtroom inside was colder than the plaza, and the judge's bench raised him above us as if he were a hill that the rest of us could not climb. The complainant's counsel opened with the cunning of men who mistook arrogance for authority. He painted a picture of deceit, a marriage procured on false grounds, documents forged or purchased, a family that had no right to property accumulated by the grace of a law that had never imagined such alliances. When my father stood to answer, there was a silence like metal cooling. He did not speak with the bitter sweetness of one who had been wronged and had staked his life on retribution. He spoke with a voice that had learned to measure the weight of words against the longevity of actions. He told them what the papers told, and then what they did not. He said plainly that there had been mistakes and cruelties in his past, that there were transactions once made in ways that now seemed like the choices of another man. He told the court, without pleading for mercy, that his greatest regret had been to treat people as property, that his greatest act of repentance had been to sign the papers that freed us, to walk away from claims that would make a mockery of the life he wanted for his children. The room shifted when he said that. Not all men in that place were capable of such confession. Some in the gallery scoffed. The counsel for the county pounced on every admission as if it were a confession of guilt to be exploited.
But there were also faces that softened. The apprentice who had learned beside us, and the widow who kept the bakery and always bought her hinges from our shop. They sat forward as if to hear a particular truth. The trial was not
A thing of one day. It spread like iron through water. Tests of witness, records read aloud, cross-examination that reached for the soft threads of our story. We brought to the bench the ledger and the manumission papers. We brought witnesses, neighbors who knew our labors, the woman who had sewed the binding on the marriage contract, the minister who had seen our vows. The county's council called men of the county who spoke of custom and propriety and of the dangers of unusual alliances that might unsettle order. I remember one man, swollen with certainty, who said plainly that what we had could not be permitted because it might set an example. There is a brutality in the idea of example. It says that some lives may be used as caution to others. It reduces a family to a lesson. My father heard it and chose again to stand on the edge of what would be lost to him rather than to us. In a moment that later seemed to the neighborhood like a small miracle, he accepted the court's right to judge facts, but denied that the court had the right to adjudge our humanity. He refused to offer a false apology to placate the men who would take from us. He said plainly that if there was law to be served, let it be served on evidence and not on rumor. If that meant fines or forfeiture of certain holdings, he would accept that consequence, rather than turn our truth into a lie to be bought. That choice cost him more than money. When the judge, an older man with the slow patience of habit, announced a judgment that split the difference our fate demanded, the county took the small parcel of land he had held as security for an old debt. It was not a large plot, but it had been the promise of a pension for his later years. He sold the rights to the right hand of the forge to satisfy what the court decreed. The county demanded fees and imposed penalties that would take years of labor to repay. Friends wrote from afar and offered what they could. Some neighbors, moved by what they had witnessed, paid small sums into the ledger, as if to keep a family afloat. Yet the best part of his sacrifice was not in the coins he gave away. In the public moment of his answer in court, he had read aloud the papers that proved our consent. He had told the truth of our vows. He had signed a statement acknowledging that we had been, by our signatures and by our labors, a family of our own making. That admission, spoken in a room made for judgment, stripped the rumor of its teeth. The judge could not, without showing cowardice, overturn the clear proof of writing and witness. After the ruling, the tension that had hung over our house loosened. People still whispered, of course. There are always those whose appetites are satisfied by rumor for longer than justice holds sway. But the question at the county, the slow turning of law and ledger, had settled like a hammer finding its mark. Our marriage remained recognized. Our children's rights to inherit were preserved. Our names were not struck from the list of persons who could hold property. In this, the choice had saved us. What it cost my father was a private diminution. He walked home from the county with pockets a little emptier, and with the look of a man who had surrendered something he had loved, and yet he walked with his head not bowed but leveled. There was, in that posture, a dignity that no fine could buy. He came back to the forge and took up the tongs, as if to remind the world that one must do what is needed with whatever tools remain. The apprentice boy hammered that evening with a steadiness that matched the rhythm of our breathing. The children slept as if soot and exhaustion had braided them into sleep. Josiah and I sat by the hearth with the ledger open between us, and we made sure that each line of account still meant more than the sum of what was owed. There were nights when I thought of the men who had stood on the courthouse bench and tried to make law into a cudgel. I thought of the small cruelty of men who measure belonging by the neatness of their prejudices. But I also thought of the other men and women, neighbors, customers, a minister who had warned us against pride, who had shown that community, when it sees a family's honest labor, can choose to be just rather than to echo rumor.
In the weeks after the trial, life resumed its ordinary strains. Winters in our town are long and stingy. The forge must be fed whether the world speaks well or ill of you. We continued to teach Thomas and the others the count of 1, 2, 3 as they measured nails. We showed them the way to lay an edge true and straight. We showed them, too, what it means to keep accounts with an honest hand. My hand, bent as it was, found a new steadiness, not simply in the shaping of metal, but in the shaping of example. I turned out hinges that would hang doors for a dozen winters. I signed receipts that would later be examined by men who did not know our names except as ink on paper. There is a persistence to work that outlasts accusation. There were, of course, costs that did not show on any ledger. My father's nights were deeper with reflection. He would go alone to the hill behind our house and sit until the stars came out. And I learned to know that when he came back, his hands were trembling in a different kind of way. We spoke then in the slow hours of the past and of
how a man measures restitution. He would tell me of his youth, of mistakes and small mercies, of markets closed to certain people and opened to others. He spoke without falsehood, but without apology that would have cheapened the truth. What he did for us was not an act to be catalogued. It was an act that rewired the family's future. The children learned more from that season than any law could teach. They learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear turn you into a traitor in your own soul. They learned that property is less secure than the bond that holds a family steady. They learned to make a hinge well, and to count well, and to speak plainly when asked. In the winter that followed, when the rumor had long lost its heat but its scar remained faint, our household had acquired a shape that was not dependent on praise. We had, by force of labor and by stubborn honesty, made ourselves a thing that would be hard to overturn. Yet the world beyond our yard continued to reckon in ways that would demand more of us. The county official's glance did not dissolve with the winter snow. There were men who would continue to stand at the edges of our lives and watch. There were accounts to be kept, and apprentices to instruct, and marriages to be strengthened by daily acts. The price my father had paid bought us time and proof, but not immunity. We had guardrails now. We did not, and would not, have immunity from the long arc of prejudice. It was in that new and precarious quiet that Josiah and I learned to hold one another with a steadier grace. There were evenings when the house smelled of iron and bread, and the children's laughter made small comets across the room. There were mornings when the ledger waited on the table, and the apprentice boy's hammer conducted a music that meant industry. We had survived a season that could have undone us, and our survival was not the result of a single triumph, but of many small proofs. Signatures on paper, a father's confession, a minister's witness, neighbor's testimony, the steady rhythm of work. I kept, like all women who live by craft, a small chest of mementos. A stub of a ribbon from my wedding, the scrap of a handkerchief that had once wiped a brow, and a folded page where my father had written, in his own hand, a short note to us after the decree. I do not know what the future will ask of us, and I do not fashion prophecies. But I know how to keep a metal true, how to bind a hinge so it will not fail, how to write the ledgers that give testimony longer than rumor. That winter closed with a thaw, and with a quiet that felt both earned and fragile. We stood in the yard one morning, my father, Josiah, the children, and watched the apprentice boy walk a rod of iron into the heat, his face set like any who would make a life by their hands. My father put his hand on Josiah's shoulder, then on mine, and his fingers held us as if to see we were still whole. He did not say that he had saved us alone. He only said, with that thin laugh he had kept, "We have kept our accounts clean." And that, for us, was the point. We had been counted, not by the rumor, nor by a county ledger, but by the small daily reckonings of love and labor that hold a life together. The rest, the cost, the scar, the markets, would come and go. The forge would go cold and hot again. The ledger would fill and be balanced. We would keep making hinges,
and in each hinge there would be the echo of the winter when truth had to be called to the bar. There are other matters yet to tell, how the children learned to carry our steadiness into town, how the apprentice's own history braided into our family, how the county's attention turned to other things and left us to our work. But those are stories for the slow craft of memory. For now, it is enough to say that the day my father chose the moral edge he had been born to sharpen, it cost him peace, and bought us the narrow but unassailable thing we had always tried to build, a household that would not be held together by rumor, but by the proofs of our hands and the witness of the few who loved us truly. The children carried our steadiness into town as if it were a pocketed thing, a folded habit they could unfurl when needed. They spoke differently now, not louder, but with a cadence that did not search for approval. At the market, they stood beside our bench and measured the price of iron as though they were weighing bread. They listened to the talk of other fathers and did not hurry to answer rumors, for they had learned that most talk lightens itself when met with work. A baker once asked one of the girls if the scandal had left us poor in spirit as well as purse. She wiped her hands on her apron and said, plainly, "We are keeping accounts." The baker laughed because he did not know what else to do, and that laugh was a small, private triumph. On Sundays, the children walked with a steadier step beside my father. He had not been spared the soft astonishments of age. His hair thinned at the temple. His laugh had become a thing that rose, careful and brief. But there was a new patience in him, a refusal to be baited by the petty slights of town life. He would watch the stream of people outside the meeting house and say nothing. Then, later, when there were men to be minded or hammers to be sharpened, he would say what needed saying and no more. Those who had once looked askance found, over time, that the smallest of his certainties were like a hinge, unnoticed until the door creaked, but then holding fast. The apprentice braided himself into us in ways that were not declared so much as lived. He arrived with one small bundle and a history that he carried with a modesty that embarrassed him more than it did the rest of us. There were nights when he would sit on the back stair and tell one of the children some crooked memory of the place he had come from, a roof that leaked, a mother who had gone, stories half told and then let fall. We did not demand completeness. My father, who had been a young man with his own scars, worked him at the forge with a firmness that was gentle. Lessons measured in strikes and time, instructions delivered as if each command were a small sacrament. He learned to make hinges as if he had been born learning them. In the way he hammered, the metal took to him. In the way he filed, he understood not only the file, but the sense of a hinge's rightness. He stayed late when he could. He rose early when he could not. In the year when my eldest daughter was betrothed, there was a quiet talk. No grand bargaining, just a measure of what the household would ask and what the new man could give. And then the apprentice took his place at our table, not as a servant, but as one who had earned the right to stay. There was nothing theatrical in it. He did not step into family with a flourish. He stepped in by slow degrees, knitting himself into chores and jokes, learning an old brother's manner of whistling at the door, learning the value of a ledger kept clean. There are households where this slow braiding fails because someone seeks to mark it by proclamation. Ours succeeded because it was a work as patient as making metal true. The apprentice's hands, once foreign to our shapes, found the small cunning of our lives. He was given a bench beside Josiah's and, in time, stood as an equal in the morning light, his apron dusted with filings and his mouth often smelling of oil. It pleased my father to see him so. Not because the lad had improved our standing in town, if anything, his history complicated the neatness the neighbors preferred, but because he have learned to carry himself according to the household's measures, honesty, industry, the refusal to trade dignity for false ease. As for the county's attention, it slackened, not because we had done anything to coax it away, but because the world beyond our yard has its own waning passions. The official who had once leaned with a predatory politeness at the edge of our life found other businesses to occupy him. A dispute over land with a more convenient scandal, a ferry accident that required papers and posturing. Men have a way of moving their appetite from one story to another. The hunger that once rimmed our door shifted its teeth to new flesh.
We did not mourn its leaving. We had not sought its leaving. We had only continued, and so the county's glance narrowed until it was drawn elsewhere. There was a kind of relief in that, but not the triumph of repentance in the world. It was, rather, an ordinary mercy, attention misplaced, and the quiet that followed used by those who know how to work. Seasons turned with the slow choreography of the country. Spring brought the small explosion of greenness and the work of mending shutters. Summer was the hot business of deliveries and the apprentice's sweat turning to a learned economy of movement. Autumn gave us ledgers to close and harvests to buy and sell. My hands, which had once learned the stitch and the curve and the fold, now kept account of how much iron had been bought and how much had left the yard. My father's hands, though less steady at the smallest tasks, could still read a ledger and a man with equal skill. He taught Josiah to look at numbers not as cold things, but as testimonies, records that, when honest, will tell the truth of a life. There was a funeral some years after the winter that had remade us. A woman from a neighbor house fell sick and did not rally. She was the sort of neighbor who had once been quick to whisper what she thought we ought to have done differently. Her death drew most of the town to her home. My father walked with the men to the graveside, his shoulders bent with the years, but his bearing unashamed. After the service, in the small, inevitable way of country conversation, someone noted that life's measures were different in the end. A man's ledger did not cross with the ledger of death. My father listened and then said, softly, "We have kept our accounts clean." It was not an assertion of innocence, as if that were the whole of life. It was a summation of the life that had been chosen, small transactions of fidelity added day by day until they were a thing that withstood rumor and grief. Children grew as children do. The eldest daughter married a man who had been apprenticed in another trade. She took with her the steadiness she had practiced in our yard. She did not carry a chest of mementos, as I did, but she carried a way of measuring what was owed to love and what was owed to truth. Josiah married later, quietly, his wedding attended by men whose hands bore the marks of work. The apprentice, when he married, our kitchen filled with the smell of yeast and a laughter that had been absent for a long while. We saw in these small migrations the proof that household acts have consequences beyond the immediate. Children who had learned to count honestly became adults who could choose rightly. My father, in the final years, took pleasure in the simplest demonstrations of skill. He would show a visitor how to judge the grain of iron the way a mason judges stone. He would place a hinge in his palm and trace its curve with a finger, as if reading a small script. Sometimes he would sit at the window and watch the children pass by, and when asked what he was thinking, he would say nothing but give that thin, private laugh that had survived many winters. He did not make proclamations about his virtue. He made, instead, small repairs. A loose stair, a door that had begun to sag, a boy's temper that needed tempering. Those repairs, more than any sermon he could have offered, taught us how to live. When he died, it was not dramatic. The body failed him as bodies do. He had lived a long workman's life, and the time came when the hinges he had made would click less often. We gathered, as families gather, with hands that both trembled and were steady. The neighbor who had once whispered came to the door and brought bread. The apprentice, who had been a son to some and a man in his own right to others, read aloud parts of the ledger as though reading a psalm. There was sobbing, and then, after the rites were done, the return to the bench and to the forge. That, too, was a kind of praise. Grief that does not pretend to be something else. Grief that clears itself onto the table and leaves room for the work to continue. I kept my small chest of mementos and added to it a folded scrap of the man's last shirt. A small, careful thing that smelled faintly of smoke and oil. I found, in the pockets of a life, notes of kindness I had nearly forgotten. A time he had sat with a fevered neighbor. A time he had attended the apprenticeship's reckoning when the lad could not pay. The one thin joke he told on his deathbed that made Josiah laugh until he cried. These were not grand relics. They were, like the hinges, proof of a life held together by small acts. In the years after, the yard lived on. The forge swung hot and cold with the seasons.
Children's voices threaded through the smoke. And the young men who had learned there carried their learning into places neither I nor my father could have predicted. We sold hinges and latches to houses of wood and doors of stone. We mended the iron bars of a farm gate and the tiny clasp of a woman's chest. With each hinge there was the echo of that winter, when truth had been called to the bar and had not been found wanting. Not because
law had promised us safety. A law is as fallible as any man, but because we had learned to hold ourselves to measures that mattered. Sometimes, on mornings when the light came in through the open shop door and the children sat outside polishing a piece of brass, I would open the folded note my father had written after the decree. It had yellowed at the crease, but the ink was steady. He had written simply that we should keep our accounts clean and our tongues honest. Beneath that, almost as an afterthought, he had folded the paper small and pressed a thumbprint, as if it were a seal. I do not know what the future will ask of any of us. I only know that certain trades, of truth, of steady labor, of plain speech, are like lessons in metallurgy. Heat reveals weakness. Cooling binds what has been forged into form. We taught the children to temper themselves. We taught them that courage is not a spectacle, but a workmanship. The shaping of a life by steady strikes, by patience at the file, by the calm checking of a hinge when the world leans upon it. They carried this into town in ways that were not heralded. The way a young man refuses a slight, the way a woman chooses a neighbor over gossip, the way a son returns to his father not to demand glory, but to learn how to set a door straight. These small daily reckonings outlast rumor, outlast the appetites of transient attention. I will end not with an epigraph nor with a moral sentence, but with a small domestic scene that has lodged in me like a splinter. On an evening when the light was slanting gold across the yard, and the apprentices' children chased one another through the sawdust, my son Josiah stood at the bench and filed a hinge, while the old dog slept at his feet. My father's chest of tools lay open, each implement familiar as the ribs of a hand. Josiah looked up at me, not speaking, and lifted the hinge to the light. I saw then what we had really kept, not a ledger that proved our worth to the town, not the absence of scars, but the ordinary capacity to meet the day's need with hands that know how to make a thing true. That, perhaps, is the most honest accounting I can give. We had paid a price and bought a narrow, unassailable thing, a household that could hold its own. We had learned to bend, to fix, to speak, and to keep silent when silence served better than defense. The forge will cool and be stoked again. The ledger will open and close with business and rest. The country will have other scandals, other appetites to satisfy. We will have our work. In each hinge we made after that winter, there was the echo of the season when truth had to be called, and we answered with the only law
We trusted, one enforced by the steady rhythm of hands and the small but inexorable honesty of daily reckoning.